My name is Heather Boucher, and I'm an economist here at CEPR, and it is just a real pleasure to see all of you here this evening. This is, I guess, the fifth in our seminar series that CEPR economists have been doing. I believe we have 5 more. And what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is a bit about gender and about women's labor supply. And the way I want to frame this is by putting it within the context of the broader labor market trends in the United States and seeing the role that women's labor supply has played in inequality and economic mobility. John Schmidt gave a talk on labor markets and inequality a couple of weeks ago. Next week I'll be talking about economic mobility. And one of the arguments that I want to make to you tonight is that the movement of women into the paid labor force is intricately intertwined with these trends around mobility and labor market inequality more generally. One of the most, in my view, actually, the top probably 3 most significant trends of the last 50 years was the movement of women into the paid labor market. And I don't think that the importance of this trend can actually be underestimated. It's had significant impacts on the way that Americans work, on the way that our social policy functions, or in fact does not function, and the way that households work, and the way that sort of inter-family dynamics work. In the 1960s, the majority of mothers were in the home most of the time, providing primary care for children, and now that is reversed. The majority of mothers are actually in the paid labor market. Working, and on average mothers work about 31, 32 hours per week, which is quite significant. On average, the American family puts in 1 3/4 jobs per year. So on average you've got one person working full-time and one person working 3/4 time, which is about 30 hours per week. So this movement of women into the labor force it's altered in so many ways the landscape of work and the landscape of policy, which is going to be the focus of the talk tonight. And one of the things that I just wanted to touch on, just very briefly, is that I am the only female economist out of 4 here at CEPR, and I am doing the gender talk. And if we do this seminar series again, there's another talk I would like to do on wage inequality and pay inequities, kind of sort of taking this to the next step. But I think that many of my colleagues could actually give the talk just as well as I could, and I'm not just doing it because I'm the woman. I just have to sort of say that. So there you go. All right, so first I want to go over some of the trends, and then I want to go over how this fits into the broader trends in terms of the labor market. And I want to talk about implications for policy. And then finally, I want to touch on an issue that's received a lot of media attention lately, or at least a front page article in the New York Times, which is this question of whether or not women are opting out of the labor market. So the focal point of my talk is that women have moved out of the home and into the labor market, but there have been a number of sort of high-profile articles that especially elite women are deciding that they don't really want to participate in the labor market and that they're bowing out. I'm going to present some facts and figures as to why that really isn't the case, and that's how we'll end things today. So first, the basic trends, if I can work the technology here. No. Back. Okay, good. All right, there we go. So the first one, and one thing that I want to sort of point out from the get-go is that I'm going to show you a number of figures and charts and tables. I'm an economist. That's what we do. But one of the things is that various tables and charts have various age ranges that are included due to some data limitations and my inability to get all the age ranges matched correctly, and also in many cases I don't necessarily want just specific age ranges. This figure and the one after it are for men and women over age 20, so including older workers in their 60s and 70s. Some of the other charts and tables I'm going to show you are just for prime age workers between 25 and 54. So if you kind of notice some inconsistencies in the numbers, it has to do with the age ranges that have been chosen. So this figure 1 is on the labor supply of men and women age 20 and over, and as you can clearly see, I'm going to use the laser here because it's neat. The labor supply, when we say labor supply, we mean the labor force participation, that is the share of men and women who are participating in the labor market, either working or actively searching for a job. So that's what we mean by labor supply. So this is the labor supply of men and women aged 20 and over, and as you can see, there's a clear downward trend for men. As of last month, the labor supply rate for men was 75.9%, meaning a full quarter of men over the age of 20 are out of the labor market. And for women, there's been this clear and significant upward trend in labor supply, and now women, 60.6% of women are participating in the labor market as of September of this year. So this right here is, I mean, this is the basis of the story that I want to talk about today. The basis of the trend is that women have been moving out of the home and into the labor market. The next slide that I want to show you, oh, no. One would think I could understand this, is sort of parceling out these trends in labor supply patterns for women by presence of children. Because when we're talking about this issue, of course, a big reason why these trends have been so important has to do with the provision of care and has to do with mothers. So a lot of the talk will focus on the distinctions between mothers and non-mothers. And here I've broken it out by, let's see, this line right here with the little diamonds is women with no children under 18. This one with the X's is women with children under age 6. Little squares is women with children under age 18. And this one at the top is women with children ages 6 to 17. So from the very get-go, and one thing that we'll talk about later sort of to end the talk is you can see after 2001, which was the period that began the period over which the official recession was during the year 2001, although the labor market did not recover its level of employment until January of 2005. So the labor market recession was much longer than just 2001. You can see after 2001 there was a slight dip in labor force participation for all kinds of women, and we'll talk about that later on. But just sort of looking at the trends prior to the early 2000s, there's a clear upward trend, and significantly a much larger upward trend for mothers than for non-mothers. So really when we're talking about this trend of women moving into the labor market, it's really about mothers moving into the labor market. It's not necessarily about women moving into the labor market, although there is a slight upward trend for women without children. And of course, one caveat here too is that due to data limitations, this series only goes back to 1975, whereas the previous chart went to 1948. But just looking over the last quarter century, it is the case that mothers, especially mothers with young children, saw the largest rise in labor force participation. So the question that I want to address today that Figure 2A highlights is it the case that women were pushed into the labor market or were they pulled? Now, why did this happen? So the rest of the talk I want to focus on why and what does it mean and how should we be thinking about it and what are many of the unsettled questions. So in many ways, I even question myself whether or not that's the right way to frame it, push or pull. That's sort of like two diametrically opposed kind of sides. But it is true that we tend to think about women's labor force participation as a choice. And that's the language that we generally hear in the media, and when we talk about it, a lot of it is about women choosing to work. And when we talk about policy, there's implications. Because if it's the case that we think that women have chosen to participate in the labor market, that this is voluntary, that this doesn't have anything to do with household economics, or that it, especially for higher educated women, is something sort of narcissistic. It's about themselves wanting to sort of realize their own potential rather than it being about their families, then that has implications for how we think about policy. Because if it's a choice, then why should we as a society be paying for that choice by providing things like subsidized childcare? Or why should employers be concerned about allowing women to make that choice and offering flexible workplace practices? So the question of whether or not women were pushed or pulled, I think, is very critical for thinking about how we talk about this issue, and especially how we hear the media and politicians talk about it. It also gets back to this question of women opting out, because even the way that that is framed, there is this element of choice. Are women choosing to not work anymore, and rather than either being forced out of the labor market or it actually not being an honest choice between work and non-work? And we'll talk about that sort of as I go through the talk. Now, there's a number of caveats that I think are important to note sort of at the beginning here. And first and foremost, many of you might be thinking, if you were at all critical of what I've said so far, that of course women have always worked, and that this whole notion of women moving into the labor market really is about more educated and higher income women moving into the labor market. It's not about all women moving into the labor market. And I just want to sort of, note that, and I think that is very important. Women of color, immigrant women, lower educated women, single mothers have always historically participated in the labor market to a much greater degree than middle class women and white women and women who have husbands to support them. So this trend, I mean, even as we talk about this movement, we really are talking about a part of women moving into the labor market, not all women. I think it's also important to note that the language around the whole notion of women working is itself subject to criticism, because it implies, of course, that they aren't working if they aren't in the paid labor market. And I just needed to recognize that I recognize the problem in that language, but it's hard to talk about paid employment. It sort of doesn't roll off the tongue as easily as talking about women working. So it's also, I think, along those lines, important to note that historically, this moment of women, quote unquote, not working and women sort of specializing in home care was the unique historical moment in the late 1940s and 1950s and early 1960s. Historically, it has always been the case that men and women have both participated in the economic production of the household, either through the fact that more people lived on farms and there was more of a household production in previous centuries, or that wives were seen as a teammate in trades and sort of mercantile activities within the home. So this notion of women being sort of home and this being a shift is, of course, a construction of what happened in the post-war period right after World War II, where there was this moment where more women were staying at home. And that is important to note as well. But the rest of that is for the history professors and not for the economists to really be talking about. So just having noted that. Pull this one aside. So setting aside these caveats for a moment, why is it that women increased their labor force participation? Was it that family economics were pushing women into the labor market, making it impossible for families to function without the economic contributions of wives? Or was it the feminist movement that opened the doors for women, sort of this empowerment notion that there were all these opportunities, and women just woke up one day in 1972 and said, hey, we don't really want to work at home. We read those books and we all really want to get jobs. And I think that there is, of course, a little bit of both. But what I want to focus on are the factors that have pushed women into the labor market, that have made it impossible for them to not participate fully in the economic lives of their families. But just to sort of note a few of the factors on the things that are pulling women into the labor market, one of the things that I think is most astounding is that young women today are preparing for participation in the labor market in record numbers. I'm sure many of you know that women are now the majority on college campuses. Women tend to do better in school. They're really preparing themselves for this lifetime of labor force participation in ways that are historic and unprecedented, which indicates that they're making significant investments in their education. I recently did a report on student loan debt and did not include gender tables, but I do have some that I looked through. And one of the things that I noted was that women actually take on more loans than men. They're more likely to take on more loans than men, which again sort of underscores the investment that young women are making in their education, and in fact making in the inference of that, of course, is that they're making it assuming that they're going to be participating in the labor market and that this is crucial for their own economic futures. A couple other things, and women have made great strides in many ways in breaking down the glass ceiling, and I think that has pulled many women into the labor market. There are many more opportunities. It used to be when our mothers entered the labor market that the overwhelming share of women were in either nursing or teaching or other caring professions, and of course now the case that there are many more opportunities and occupations open, which is not to say that everything is solved. Women are still only about 16% of corporate CEOs, which is about double the share that they were back in the mid-90s, and that's great, but that's whatever. It's really still not all that big. And I think one other factor that is also pulling women into the labor market is the recognition that their economic security is contingent on their continued labor force participation. We've just been through this long debate in this country around Social Security, for example. Women are far less prepared for retirement than are men because they earn less over the course of their lives and because they still take off a year or two generally when they have kids. In the Social Security, women usually get less, but they also are less prepared in terms of their 401ks, and continual full participation in the labor market is one of the ways to ensure retirement security. It's also, of course, worth noting that women are much more likely to end up in poverty when they are old and they live longer. And increasingly, women's participation in the labor market is the only way for them to also access health insurance because companies are decreasing their coverage for dependents and children. So these, I think, those are kind of factors that are pushing, but I think they're also, we could call them pull factors that are luring women into the labor market because they're understanding the long-term implications of not participating. So I want to go through a number of the factors that are critical in pushing women into the labor market. And I want to start off with a couple of slides that John Schmidt, for those of you who were here, just a show of hands, how many people were here for John's lecture on the labor market? Okay, excellent. Well, there's 3 charts from his talk, and I must say, as a labor economist, I don't think that these charts can be shown often enough. So I'm happy to re-show them, and if you're bored, you can close your eyes for a few minutes. But I would suggest you pay attention. Okay, let's see if I can get this correct. Okay, so the first one that I want to talk about is that, basically the point of the next 4 or 5 slides I'm going to show you is that without the economic contribution of wives, family income in this country on average would have fallen since the 1970s. And that is a clear trend, especially for families in the middle on down. It's not necessarily true for families at the top, but that this has been critical for families maintaining the standard of living that their parents had. And for most Americans, all they really want, in some grand sense, is to do better than the people before them. And for families to do better economically, to have more stuff, to have more economic security, they've needed the contributions of wives. So this first chart that John showed last week, and this little line here that is supposed to be at 100, but I couldn't get it to work in Excel, so just bear with me on that. So this is real hourly wage growth for men from 1979 to 2004. And as you can clearly see, for men in the bottom 10th percentile, that is the bottom 10% of male wage earners, and men at the 50th percentile, that is the median male, the average male in the labor market, earnings for them were falling from 1973. Title does not matter. That's my fault that I did the title, not John. Earnings were falling from 73 until the early 1990s, and then it was only after the strong labor market of the mid-1990s, the full employment that we saw after 1995-96, that wages started rising for this group of men, for these 2 groups of men, but that still, as of the early 2000s, and of course this 100% line is a little bit too high, so it's really more about there. But it wasn't until the early 2000s, 1999, that male wages actually were where they had been way back when. So that's important because that has significant implications for family economics and how families are able to maintain their consumption in the face of falling real male wages. Now, at the same time, as you saw on the first slide, this was the first 2 slides. This was a period of significant increases in women's labor force participation, especially for mothers. And part of the reason they were increasing in the labor market is, let me go to John's second slide here, is that women, at least at the median and at the 90th percentile, were seeing significant increases in wages over this period. And of course, a lot of this stuff, especially for the top-end women, this has to do with the breaking down of the glass ceiling and decreasing the amount of occupational segregation that we see in the labor market, all topics that I will cover if I get to give this talk again, but not today. And for women at the bottom, of course, they were subject to many of the same trends that men have been subject to, but that still it is the case that for the average woman, her earnings were increasing, pulling her into the labor market and really helping families to maintain their standard of living. And for that, I want to move to Table 1. This is a table from the State of Working America from last year, page 104. And this is one of my favorite tables, actually, from the entire book. If you've seen this book, it's very big and thick. But this is, I think, one of the highlights. Because what it shows us is just how important the earnings of wives have been since the 1970s in maintaining the standard of living for families. And rather than point to that, let me look at my notes here. So what you see is that for families in the bottom fifth, that is the bottom 20% of families in terms of earnings, if you were to line up all of the families in America from one end to the other by earnings or by income, the bottom 20% of those, they would have seen their income fall by 13.9% without wives' earnings between 1979 and 2000. As it was, those families only saw a 7.5% increase in their income, which is not that big in historical standards, actually quite small. But without wives' income, it actually would have declined, and declined significantly. For families in the second fifth, you would have seen a decline of nearly 5%, 4.6% in family income without the contribution of wives. As it was, those families saw a 15.9% increase in their income. Now, it's not until you get to the middle and then the upper fifths of families where without wives' incomes would families actually have not seen a negative, but they would have seen a much smaller growth in their family income over this time period. Even at the top, where families saw a 63% increase in family income between 79 and 2000, without wives increased earnings, that would have been 10 percentage points lower, 51.5%. So you cannot stress enough just how important wives' income has been for maintaining the standard of living, especially for families at the bottom of the income distribution. And many of the things that John touched on in his talk, and that we'll touch on again when we talk about mobility next week, that were important for limiting the bargaining power of workers relative to their employers. Things like the decline in the purchasing power of the minimum wage, deunionization, deregulation, privatization, recessionary macro policy, and the like, all of course affected women workers as well. But these same broad macro trends that had these negative effects, especially on manufacturing workers and good sort of blue-collar workers, one could argue, and I am arguing, had this effect on the other end of pushing wives into the labor market. So when we talk about globalization and its effect on male workers, you have to be very careful to also note that this has a reverberating effect through the family and has this effect on increasing women's labor supply and increasing the supply of folks available for many of the kinds of jobs that women still do in the service sector and the like. Train of thought gone. Something at any rate. So that's enough on that chart. Okay, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I hate it when that happens. Okay, so I want to go back to one more chart that John showed from, I guess it was 3 weeks ago, and that is to just show you what really happened to real median household income. The table that I just showed talked both about real but also talked about what would have happened if wives hadn't been contributing. But as it was, real median household income has been relatively flat since the early 1970s. So even though you had this significant increase in wives' labor force participation, and even though without that participation, household income would have, family income would have fallen, it is still the case that families have not been doing all that great, even though they've had wives in the labor market as well. One of the things that I wanted to mention about this, in terms of when you're thinking about the quality of life that families experience and how people live their, go about their day-to-day activities, it's not really a one-off to think that, okay, well, male wages are falling, and so wives are increasing their labor force participation, and that's just kind of fine and good. While wives are moving into the labor market, of course, that has huge implications for what's happening inside the home. And all of the work that we've seen that's developed in the 80s, 90s, and sort of moving forward that people have been doing on work-family balance and on the time crunch and the stresses that families are seeing, and you can pick up the newspaper any day and be reading about this, is of course related to the falling male wages and the fact that there's really no one left in the home to provide care. And at the same time, the labor market has not adjusted to allow families time off, especially paid time off, to provide that care. I'll get to that a little bit more later, but It is worth noting that these numbers that we economists like to look at, income, easily measurable things, it's only measuring how much money a family has. It's not really measuring the true quality of life, that even though wives were able to maintain family income, the cost in terms of time and family stress and what's going on inside the home has been significant, and it's nowhere in that chart, which is annoying. So, and then finally, one last thing on this section of the talk. Wives' economic contributions have not only been critical for maintaining household income, but they've also been critical for economic mobility. And as I've alluded to a number of times, the next talk, which I'm going to do next week, is on economic mobility. But just to preview that and to preview how important this trend is in the overall economic trends. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I have one more chart. Then I get to go into that. Just moved along too quickly here. This one last chart that I wanted to show you is also from the State of Working America. And here, what they've done is they've decomposed the annual earnings growth for prime-age wives with children. And this is, again, one of those cases where we're only looking at women between the ages of 25 and 54, not all women. And it is the case that the increase in annual hours worked is the more significant factor in annual earnings growth for women in the middle and the second fifth and the bottom fifth. For women at the top, it's been the higher wages that they've been receiving over the past between 79 and 2000, whereas for lower income women and moderate income women, it's been they're working more, and that's been what's contributing to their increased income, not that they're actually earning more, which gets back to this chart right here, where we saw that women at the bottom have just seen their earnings come back to where they had been back in the late 1970s. So for these women to really be contributing to their family income, it's about working more, whereas for women at the top, they've seen this significant increase in pay. So their contribution to household income has not just been about working more, but it's also been about the fact that they were at the top of the income distribution and were making more. Okay, now I want to move on to mobility. I'm going backwards. Sorry. Technology. Okay, so, I don't have a mobility chart. That's the problem here. They're just numbers we're going to talk about. So the point about the mobility is that there's been a number of recent research on economic mobility that shows that households in the United States are not moving up as quickly as they had been in the past. It's much harder to move up the job ladder. But that the households that have moved up, that have found themselves at a higher income level at age 50 than they were at age than their parents were, or where they were at age 20, the share of people that actually sort of move up. Those families that have been able to move up have done so because of wives' greater labor force participation. And that's a significant and contributing factor. The families that actually see upward economic mobility have done so because wives have been in the labor market, and the families that have not seen economic mobility have been more likely to have wives not participating in the labor market, have been more likely to not have wives not participating in the labor market. Okay. So if the point isn't clear enough yet, what I'm trying to argue to you tonight is that the economics of the family over the past quarter century has required a second earner in the home. That you can't really get around the fact that male wages were falling, and that a critical component of maintaining family income was the second earner. So this push factor, these factors pushing women into the labor force, are critical and very important. And that in most families, the wife is at work not necessarily, it could be that she really wants to, but it also is the case that she's at work because she has to be. So as we talk about choice and we talk about the kinds of policies that are important for working families, I think this idea of necessity of work is something that we need to bear in mind is critical, and not just necessity for women's personal development, but for families as a whole. And I say that not because I'm not a feminist, and I don't think that women's personal development is not critical, but as we talk about it in terms of policy and policy circles, the focus on the family, is of course important as well, and kind of gets you further supposedly, although we haven't really seen a lot of that. Anyway, one of the things that I also wanted to point out is that the movement of women out of the labor force, or out of the home and into the labor force, also has had an impact on the way that households, on family budgets, and the way that families are able to conceive of how much they need to make ends meet. So what I'm trying to get at here is that when most families had one earner in the home, that led to markets for housing and education in particular that were based on most families having one earner. So the cost of these kinds of goods could not be bid up as quickly by two income households. And one of the things that we've seen over the past few decades is, of course, a run-up in both housing prices, especially over the past few years, and education. Housing in particular is an area where CEPR has argued a lot there is a bubble, but it's also the case that as you move from one income families to two income families, even if that second income is only adding about 30% more, about 30% of the total family income, it allows families to bid up prices for goods that singles cannot. So it also creates this conundrum that as family income has stagnated, many of the fixed costs that families have to pay for have become more expensive. And some of this is related to the increase, and some of this is also related to broader economic trends. I do not want to overstate the case for this at all, but I do think it's important to at least think about. So this is a chart from a book by Elizabeth Warren and her daughter Amelia Warren Tiaki. I can't pronounce her last name, so I won't try anymore. But the book is called The Two Income Trap, and I think this is a very sort of evocative and interesting way of painting that problem. That when you look at a single income family in the early 1970s, their fixed costs for their mortgage, their child care, their health insurance, their car, and their taxes was just a little bit over half the total income that the family had available on average if it was a single earner family. I mean, again, we know that there have been significant increases over this period in the cost of many of these fixed costs, health insurance, education, child care, housing. When you look at a dual income family in the early 2000s, their fixed costs, the things that if you get laid off you can't really stop paying for, you can't sort of cut down on, are now more than twice the amount of the discretionary items. So what this means is that as women have moved into the home, right, it's not, so we've talked a lot about why women have moved into the home. One of the things that has happened as most families have dual earners is that they're trapped into these fixed cost items that are not easy. It's not easy to cut down on if one household member loses their job. And that's a lot of the kinds of things that we've seen over the course of the most recent recession. So for example, if you own a home and you have health insurance and you have car payments, all of those kinds of costs are generally fixed. You can't necessarily, if you lose your job tomorrow, it's very difficult to sell your house in 2 weeks in order to cut down on your housing costs. We tend to think of those as fixed costs, things that you're kind of stuck with. Whereas the discretionary items, food or clothing, those are the kinds of things when an economic shock hits a family, you can cut down on. You can eat out less. You can stop going to the movies. You can stop buying new shoes. But so one of the ways of thinking about one of the implications of a broader, of more families having two earners is how it's had this impact on fixed and discretionary costs. So, okay, moving right along, I want to spend a few minutes. I'm running over, but that's okay. I've been told. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the implications for 3 specific areas of social life. So I've tried to stress that this answer to how we think about women participating, especially mothers participating more in the paid labor market, whether or not we think it's push or pull, has an impact about how we think and how we talk about policy. There are 3 broad areas that the movement of women into the labor market has had a direct effect on. The first, of course, is workplace practices. The second would be family, sort of intra-household practices. And the third would be the area of social policy. And I would argue in none of the 3 have those institutions fully adapted or, quite frankly, even partially adapted to the new realities of what the labor market looks like and the fact that most women are working. I think education is adapted quite well, but these other broader institutions that deal with adults and people with children certainly have not. Turning first to workplaces, it is the case that the majority of workers do not have access to paid sick leave if their child is sick. Over 60% of workers do not have access to paid sick leave in the case of a child. I can't think of, there's many unfamily friendly ways of working and policy that we have in this country, but that one seems to me a particularly important one. In the way that workplaces have not adapted to the notion that in the vast majority of households there is no one at home to take care of a sick child, or grandma falls down and needs to be taken to the doctor. There's no one at home to do these things, and workplaces have not taken it upon themselves to voluntarily provide workers with the access to the paid time off that they need to deal with these short-term or even long-term emergencies. So in that way, they really quite simply have not even started to adapt. The second way that workplaces have not adapted, and in fact have not have moved in the opposite direction, is that while women have moved into the labor market, the average hours of work have been increasing. And I've read many papers about elite occupations where some feminists have made the argument that some kinds of occupations have actually increased hours of work as a way of keeping women out. But sort of putting that aside, it remains the fact that Americans are putting in more hours as individuals on their jobs and also as families, and we're getting no more in vacation and, of course, no more in paid sick time. So if you have both family members out there in the labor market without any time off and families are working more and more, this creates real problems for what's going on inside the home and whether or not families are able to enjoy their lives, let alone provide care. Finally, another way that workplaces have not adapted is that there are still very limited opportunities for reasonable part-time employment. And when I say reasonable, I mean part-time employment that is remunerated, at least in a prorated way, relative to full-time, where workers have similar levels of pay or benefits, or importantly, access to promotions and benefits and upward mobility. So moving right along to family life. I think that there are a few ways that family life has actually shown some more signs of adaptation compared to workplaces and social policy. Time use surveys are actually reporting that both husbands and wives are spending that husbands are spending more time on household labor and childcare, and wives are spending slightly less. It still remains the case that, and it's not housework, if you have my notes, it's actually childcare. That's a little typo there. But it still remains the case that women spend about twice as much time on a day-to-day basis on childcare. But in terms of housework, it's getting closer to parity. So there have been some changes, and time use surveys are not available on an annual basis, and we don't have any consistent time use surveys. But from what we can tell from surveys that have been done at various points in time, it does appear that there is some adaptation going on within the home, which is interestingly occurred alongside of flattening divorce rates, but that's for somebody else to analyze. The other thing about adaptation within the home is that men are actually highly likely to use the unpaid family and medical leave. They are, of course, more likely to use it for their own illness than to provide care or for somebody else's, but there is a growing awareness that both men and women are, of course, equally eligible for unpaid family and medical leave. And for those of you to just recap on that, that's 12 weeks of unpaid leave that any worker who's worked at a firm for more than a year, more than part-time, where there are more than 50 people employed in the firm, is eligible for. It covers about half the workforce, eligible for 12 weeks of unpaid leave to care for a new child or for your own illness or a family member's illness. So men are using that, which of course creates a precedent for them to hopefully start using it to care for family members. And I think as we see the baby boomers kind of moving into, as they are moving through their own parents getting sick and older, I think we are starting to see signs of men taking more of that. So that's in terms of adaptation to women's work within the home. And now finally, I want to move on to the social policy. I would argue that in the United States, our social policy is completely, well, not completely, but they're very unfocused on the realities facing families and the fact that women are not necessarily choosing to work and it's not frivolous, but that families need the labor of both the husband and wife in the labor force. The United States is one of very, very few countries in the world that has no paid maternity or paternity leave. U.S. workers, unlike most other workers around the world, have no right to paid sick leave as a guaranteed right of citizenship. And of course, we have a completely inadequate child care system, and it remains the case that about 40% of schools still offer only half-day kindergarten, which is a highly unfamily-friendly, workplace family-friendly kind of thing to do. There are some movements, and they're happening at the state level, not the federal level. Over the past few years, there have been innovations in universal pre-kindergarten for 4-year-olds in a number of states. Interestingly, the states that have moved the furthest along on this are Oklahoma and Georgia. And many of the other states that have moved significantly towards providing public preschool for 4-year-olds, other states include Texas, Louisiana, South Carolina, Kentucky, West Virginia, and then New Jersey, New York, Maryland, Illinois, and Wisconsin. I do think it's interesting that a number of the states that have made the earliest innovations in this area are southern states, which typically have lower wages, and especially have been some different levels of inequity between men and women. But it does seem like there is some attention, at least, to the family implications of wives working that they've been addressing that we have not even been able to talk about at the national level. So I wanted to just end by showing a few slides about this question of whether or not women are opting out of employment by choice. And I realize that I'm going over time, but I'm just going to take the speaker's prerogative and just go ahead and finish, because I usually don't run over. So there's been a number of stories that were in the New York Times. There's a big piece 2 years ago by Lisa Belkin about Princeton women, women who graduate from Princeton deciding that they just couldn't hack it anymore in the labor market, and they didn't want to be there, and so they were going to stay home. And then there was a piece on the cover of the New York Times, I guess 3 or 4 weeks ago, by a young woman named Louise Story, who's a recent Yale graduate, working in the education department of the New York Times, who got a cover story piece, which I'm sure she was thrilled about how young women at Yale, she did a survey of 19-year-olds, are saying that they intend to drop out of the labor market when they turn 30 and decide to marry and have kids. Now, that's all very nice for those who can afford it. And I think that the interesting thing in doing press around that issue and in talking to people is just how completely different the realities are for the very top echelons of our society who can afford to make those kinds of choices versus the rest of us. And one of the things that really just pisses me off about that, quite frankly, is that there's no recognition that there is recognition. The reality is that dual career households with kids sounds very stressful. And when you read the surveys and you talk to people, families are working more. They don't have any social supports. A lot of people live away from parents or relatives that can help them with childcare. And for women who have the choice to say, wow, that seems like maybe not for me, is not really recognizing that the rest of us simply don't have that choice, and that policymakers need to not focus on whether or not, like, that so-called choice that women are making, and look at the array of options that they have before them. The analogy that I like to use is that if you are a vegetarian and you are being taken to a rib and steak place, your choice to go hungry and have a baked potato is no indication of what you want to eat. It's all because there's not really an array of options in front of you. And I think that's certainly the case around these issues around work family and around the implications that we see for more women working. So, having said that, Dean Baker and David Rosnick and I did a Labor Day paper where we looked at this question, and I want to go back. This is figure 2B, where I've taken figure 2 and I've just made bigger the section between 1999 and 2004 to give you a sense of when folks are talking about opting out, is there really a trend? And as you might be guessing, my answer is going to be no. But just to look at the raw numbers, to the sort of the person who hasn't spent a lot of time thinking about the whys, you look at this trend in women with children under 6, you do see a very sharp decline in labor force participation. It falls from 65.3% in the peak in 2000 down to 62.2% in 2004. That's a 3.1 percentage point fall in labor force participation, and quite frankly, that's big. And if we go back, which I won't do, but if you go back and look at the first and second charts, you can see that these are trends that move relatively slowly, and a fall like that, which is inconsistent with prior trends, might indicate that something is going on. Well, what you need to think about in understanding why this has happened and whether or not it is about women opting out, we have to think about what happened in the labor market over this period. And we argue in our paper that it was the lackluster labor market that led to falling employment for women. And some of this is sort of the result of women's economic success in a way. The recession of the early 2000s was harder on women than any previous recession had been, in that women lost more jobs than they had previously. Well, the thing there is that as we've been talking about through this whole past 45 minutes, women have been moving into the labor market, and as they've been doing that, they've been moving into a broader array of occupations and fields. And because there's more women, and because they're not all just teachers and nurses now, they're employed in the kinds of occupations that are actually more susceptible to economic fluctuations. When there's a recession, there is not typically a great deal of layoffs that happen in teaching, nursing, childcare, caring professions that women have historically, the vast majority of women have been employed in. But as women have moved into a broader array of occupations, they too have been hit by recessions. And so it's sort of equal opportunity in employment has led to equal opportunity in unemployment when the economy goes sour. So one way of looking at this is that, as I sort of said at the beginning of the talk, the labor market, and in fact for men still, hasn't recovered. I'll just show you the two charts and then make the point. This is changes in employment level for men, and as you can see for men, their employment level, total private employment, is still 0.5. Is that a percent, David, or is that a number? I think it's a percent. It's a percent change. Percent change is lower than it was at the start of the last recession in March of 2001, i.e., there are less men at work now, or as of May of 2005, than there were at the beginning of the recession. The recession hit them so hard that 4 years later they still hadn't recovered their jobs back. And that's very different than the previous recession. It's not different than the recession of the early 1980s, but usually that far out, men have recovered, they have recovered their jobs. Moving to the last slide, what's different is that women typically haven't been hit as hard and are much more likely to recover their jobs much quicker after a recession happens. So typically up through even the jobless recovery of the early 1990s, women's employment was 6.6 percentage points higher that far out. I guess that's 4 years and 2 months out relative to the beginning of the recession. What's different is that in this recession, women's employment has not recovered either. So when we talk about this question of opting out, and if this slide, 3 slides ago, is indicative of a broader trend, is this that women are choosing to leave the labor market? You can't look at that chart without looking at this one, noting that this is the recession that has been hardest on women, and it's taken women the longest to regain their jobs. Now, having said that, it is the case that women with children have lost more jobs than women without children. And to that, I would reply that as jobs have become scarcer, I think you've also seen companies less willing. I mean, first of all, there's the reality of family economics. If there's no jobs out there, it may be that mothers are saying, well, I could use that time productively at home. So there may be some preferences there to say, wow, there's really no jobs, and 20 some odd % of workers out there pounding the pavement looking for jobs have been searching for at least 6 months, and women with children are much more likely to report when they're out of work that they're actually caring for children, i.e. dropping out of the labor force, than are men, because it's more socially acceptable. But at the same time, it is the case that during the late 1990s, when the labor market became very tight, employers started doing a lot more to lure mothers into the workplace and to create more family-friendly workplace policies, building a child care center, offering people workplace flexibility, or doing the kinds of things that made it easier for parents to be employed. We haven't seen an increase in those trends since the recession, and there are anecdotal reports that we've actually seen a decrease in the ability of people to take advantage of these trends, but of course we don't have any good survey data on that, but I think that's certainly a place to look for why mothers' employment may have dropped slightly more, and it's only slightly more, than non-mothers. So, women in the labor market are here to stay. I think that, as we're thinking about whether or not women are pushed and pulled, I do think it's important to recognize the value of, for many women, of work and the self-actualization that brings with it, but especially for women who are sort of at the lower end of the economic spectrum, that we could clearly see their labor income has been absolutely necessary to their family economics. One has to question whether or not that's all about choice or whether or not it's about need. And that the same trends that have been driving economic inequality, I would argue, are also implicated in this movement of women into the labor force. This is, again, not to denigrate the feminist movement and how important that has been for creating opportunities for women, but that these two things have occurred simultaneously, and quite frankly, I don't think you can disentangle which is sort of the more important factor. And I think on that note, I will end. So thank you very much.